Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Life Minutes, coming to you from Oak Ridge Community Church. We are glad that you have joined us. The gal who tapes our Life Minute videos has told me I need to smile more, so I'm really a happy guy, so we will work on doing that. But we're going to get into the Word of God. We began over the last couple of Life Minutes a look at the life of Christ. We were just taking some snapshots regarding how Jesus interacted with people and things that he taught. I think every time you read the Gospels, even if you read a familiar story that includes Christ, we learn something new. Maybe there's an insight that we didn't see before. We're going to share a very familiar story today. We're going to talk about Jesus and how to handle stone throwers. I'll explain what we mean by stone throwers. You will recognize that you have encountered these people in your life. Hopefully none of us would be included as people who throw stones at others. But how do you deal with people like that? We are going to see what Christ had to say to people who were, as we've said, stone throwers. And we'll explain what we mean by that. We are in John chapter 8. It is a very familiar story. In fact, almost every translation of the Bible, if you read the first 11 verses of John 8, there's always a footnote telling us that in the earlier manuscripts of the Gospel of John, the story about this woman caught in sin by the religious leaders and brought to Jesus was not in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. In fact, this story in some manuscripts is actually found in another one of the Gospels. The question of whether this event that we're going to read about really happened or not, I'm not going to debate that today, except to tell you this. I do believe that this happened. I believe that it was maybe added to some of our Greek manuscripts, but I believe the story is real. It just lines up perfectly with what we know about Jesus and his interactions with people. So with that in mind, we're going to get into John chapter 8, all right? This is a real event, I believe, that happened during the ministry of Jesus. He's teaching in the temple, and people are just thronging to him. Crowds, wherever Christ went, there were crowds. And the people were sitting there and they were listening to Jesus teach. And then the crowds began to sort of be pushed aside as a group of religious leaders forever trying to destroy Jesus and his ministry. They push through the crowd and they're dragging a woman with them who they claim has been caught in sin. That's found in John 8:3. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" Well, obviously, the whole event, the whole reason behind what the religious leaders are doing here is they want to try to trap Jesus. They thought if Jesus were to say, no, this woman does not need to be punished, they would argue that he was opposing the Old Testament law, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. If he said put her to death, he would be doing only what Rome had the authority to do. It was an attempt to trap Christ. Either he'd speak out against the Old Testament, so against Judaism, or he'd speak out against the governmental authorities. Any decision, any word Jesus made or had to say, they would see this as an opportunity to trap him. Well, let me just note a couple of things before we get into the conversation that Jesus has with these religious leaders and with this lady. According to the Old Testament law, the sin that this woman was supposedly caught in, not only should she have been brought before people, but so should the man. The man should have also been dealt with. That's what the law said in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. No doubt, too, that this sin was a struggle in this lady's life. Every one of us have sins that we wrestle with. This was one that seemed to have had a grip on her. Christ is going to offer her freedom from this sin. But here's what we learn when you read the story. The religious leaders could care less about this woman. That's the sad commentary here. They didn't care. They weren't about to give her a second chance. They're stone throwers, if we can put it that way. People who throw stones at others. And we're talking more in a verbal sense. And are unwilling to give people second chances. Because they could have, like I said, they could have cared less about this woman. They wanted to use her to trap Jesus. Those type of people are usually proud and arrogant. They really do have a high view of themselves. They're extremely self-righteous. They're uncaring. They're legalistic. Jesus knew what they were doing. He knew what they were trying to get him to say, and I love his response. Now, so these verbal stones are being thrown about this woman. They're also being thrown at Jesus in a subtle way to trap him. You know, they're calling Jesus out, shall we say. And it says in verse 6, they said this to test him. And the word test here means in a negative way. They're trying to undermine Christ, that they might bring some charge against him. And what does Jesus do? It tells us that he bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. Now, here's the deal. Jesus does not answer them. The first thing he does is he kneels down and he starts writing something in the dirt. Nobody knows what Christ wrote. The Bible doesn't tell us. There are those who speculate, because that's all we're doing is speculating, that he wrote the names of all the religious leaders that were standing in front of him with this woman. And he wrote down their names and all of their sins. So he was publicly identifying their transgressions. If they're going to bring this woman before all these people, then Jesus says, look, how about you, Bartimaeus, or whatever the religious leader's name is, how about this sin? Some people think that he was writing the 10 Commandments. We don't know what he was writing, but we do know that he kneeled down, he writes, with his finger on the ground. And verse 7 tells us that the religious leaders kept demanding an answer. They wanted Jesus to respond to them, and they wouldn't let up. So then he says this. Okay. He looks at all of these religious leaders and he says, okay, go ahead, stone her. But let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Jesus knew what these men were like. He also says, if you're going to do this, you better make sure that you're in a position to judge her, which none of them were. And Jesus knew what was in the hearts of these men. And verse 8 says that once more he bent down and he wrote in the ground. Maybe he kept writing the names of these guys, or who knows, the 10 Commandments. Like I said, we don't know, but whatever he wrote troubled the religious leaders. Christ knew what he was doing. And he basically says, well, go ahead. You want to judge her, you want to deal with her, go ahead and do it, but you better make sure that you're in a position to do that, and none of them were. They were basically taking the place of God. God's law spells out specific things that we should and shouldn't do. We get that. And the Jews living under the Old Testament law, these religious leaders took it often to the extreme. Not that there weren't You know, when we sin, for example, we know there are repercussions for that when we sin. But that's not the point. These arrogant religious leaders, they're out to get Jesus, and they're going to use people, anybody they can find, to do that. And then it says in verse 9, when they heard what Jesus had said, they began to go away, walk away, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Now the crowd is still there, but it's just Jesus and this woman. The religious leaders all kind of file away. They push their way through the crowd. He's embarrassed them, Jesus has. He's not a fan of stone throwers. Now, Jesus wants people to live holy, righteous lives. But stone throwers are so busy judging others, looking for faults in everybody else, they don't deal with themselves. The thing to keep in mind is that Jesus never condones what this woman did. He just simply will tell her, I'm giving you a second chance. You go and you sin no more. Put your faith and trust in me and go out and live a different kind of life. He shows amazing grace and mercy. We know that the religious leaders spent a lot of time judging others. Christ knew that when they brought this woman to him. What I've discovered is people usually throw stones or judge others based on their own man-made, quote, religious rules, because they want to cover up their own weaknesses, and it's easy to try to find fault in other people, and that's what these religious leaders were doing, and Jesus calls them out on that. Stone throwers don't want you to see their weaknesses. They have a hard time admitting they have weaknesses, and even when they admit those, they're not willing to deal with them, and so they try to get the attention off of their own issues and find problems in others. Sometimes people that throw stones and judge others, they do it to be accepted by people. They want to look good, and so they're willing to mistreat others so that a certain group of people will like them or accept them. Or they just want to get back at somebody. They don't like you because you're a Christian. They don't like you for this or that. They'll do whatever they can to make themselves feel good. People who judge or are like our religious leaders here in John are who the stone throwers are. And then here's the advice that Jesus offers to you and I. Because we're going to encounter people that are going to verbally attack us. They're going to say things and do things that are less than gracious and kind. And sometimes they'll even do it in the name of religion or Christianity. Now, there is a place to call sin sin. We do that because we love and care about other people. But we're talking about individuals who spend a lot of time pretty much just, putting others down and not helping to expose false teaching, but to just go after brothers and sisters in Christ or other people they just don't like. So here's what Jesus did in this setting, all right? When he dealt with these religious leaders, first, if you notice, he didn't get into the name calling. He didn't get into the verbal lobbing of stones, shall we say, or the lobbing of verbal stones. Christ refused to go down that road. He simply challenged the heart of those that were judging this woman. But he didn't lower himself to their level. A second thing that you see here, Jesus confronted them. And I think we need to do that sometimes. We need someone that we hear that maybe is slandering somebody or trying to ruin somebody. We need to it's a Christian that we know doing this, trying to ruin somebody else. We need to confront them and say, look, are there issues that maybe you should be dealing with instead of just going after this other person? Because usually a stone thrower isn't saying things to try to help the other person. They're just attacking them. That's what these guys were doing. They're attacking Jesus. They're using this woman. it's a mess. And so Jesus says, hey, remind stone throwers that they have things to work on. A third thing that you see here is don't become like them. Don't find ourselves, we already said this, but don't lower ourselves to the same level as those that are verbally judging or being rude and mistreating people. Don't lower ourselves to that as followers of Christ. And then last, we need to protect those being attacked. It doesn't mean we have to condone what they're doing. That's not what we're saying. We don't condone their sin. But we have to take a stand and say, look, yes, they're struggling. Let's help them. Let's help them. We teach truth. We try to help people that need the help. And then we leave it to the Lord. Because people who love to throw those verbal stones and love to judge others, we need to challenge them. We need to actually protect people that are being attacked. And again, it doesn't mean that if someone is being verbally attacked, doesn't mean that they may not have a sin in their life that is really messing them up. But we don't need to pile on. We need to say to the stone thrower, look, let's try to help the person. Whether that person accepts our help or not is on them. But we don't need to get involved in the tearing down of another individual. Christ doesn't condone what the woman does, but he offers her help, and that's what we need to do. Hey, thanks for joining us. Next week, we're going to look at another passage in the Gospel of John. In fact, these 3 videos that we'll kind of finish the life of Christ up on are all from John's Gospel. So until next week, have a great day, and we'll see you soon.